My dear young friends, I am going to talk to you about Indian writing in English. I am going to talk to you today about R.K. Narayan, Rasipuram, all right, Krishna Swami, Narayana Swami, that was his full name. But it was Graham Greene, his good friend and mentor, who, when he first read Swami and Friends in manuscript form, suggested maybe you should drop the Swami, because you can't have the title of your novel as Swami and Friends and your name is Narayana Swami. So here was a great writer who was sufficiently humble and who was also ambitious because he wanted to shine in the world of letters, who voluntarily accepted an abbreviation of his name. So we now know him as R.K. Narayan. Very charming story, don't you think? Now he lived for a long time, 93 years, and he died in 2000. I think he died in Chennai, which is where he was born. So in fact, in some way, his life had come full circle, because after being born in Chennai, his parents moved to Mysore, so he had to go to Mysore. And I think around the age of 7 or 8 or 9, he went to Mysore and joined the college, the school, where his father happened to be the headmaster. In Chennai, he lived in a place called Puruswakam, in which he went to 1 or 2 schools. And his experience in school was not very, very pleasant, particularly because he happened to be the only Tamil Brahmin child in a class made up of a lot of Christian students. And it was a Christian missionary school. And so there were plenty of occasions where Narayan felt a little threatened because of the attitudes which missionaries had about Hinduism, gods and so on. I mention all this because much of this gets into Swami and Friends, which is his first novel. But it was not the first thing which he ever wrote. He wrote some short stories and he kept writing short stories all his life. And his first publication was in Punch. Punch is one of the great magazines of London. And in his childhood, Narayan read all the stories and essays which appeared in many of these well-known magazines, English magazines. Because his father, being the headmaster of a good school, the Maharaja's school, was able to subscribe to some of these magazines for the school library. But since he was the headmaster's son, the librarian didn't mind lending him the magazines to take home. So he was a voracious reader, and he had internalized the whole of English tradition. Some of his favorite writers were people like Dickens and P.G. Wodehouse. And have you read any P.G. Wodehouse? Slippery world. You never know when something is going to crumble. Everything seems to be certain. The next page, you find that all that is crumbling. And it is precisely that kind of vulnerability which you find in R.K. Narayan's world as well. He has the Dickensian capacity for characterization. Wonderful characters we have in Narayan's novels. And so the English tradition was very, very important for Narayan. And that is why when he writes, he is able to look at the English language, and he respects the English language, particularly its grammar, its syntax, its usages, and its idioms. When he calls for Bharat English or a Bharat brand of English, he doesn't mean that we have to dislocate English grammar, which is what some other writers do. They feel that when we write in English, we must make it look as un-English as possible. Well, Narayan is not doing that. He gives you an English language which we all understand. And that is one of the secrets why Narayan is so popular all over the world. Even today, with so many Indian writers in English coming into the forefront, the latest being Adiga, who won the Booker Prize for a very unreadable novel called The White Tiger. I've read it recently, so I can tell you. Narayan continues to be a hot favorite when you go abroad. Every foreign teacher of English will know Narayan, whether he or she knows about the other writers or not. It's something to be said, isn't it, for a person who is able to write in such a transparent, simple style. It's a Gandhian style. That is what I think I would like you to remember, that Gandhi himself wrote in a very transparent, straightforward way. Because for Gandhi, language was a vehicle for communication. And he didn't like frills, he didn't like rhetoric. He wrote directly and spoke to your heart. Narayan has that capacity to do this. Well, Narayan is not just a novelist, he is an essayist. And he wrote small middles for various newspapers from the 1930s till practically the 1980s, which means something like 50 to 60 years of short essay writing. Narayan is a great master of the essay style. You've heard of the essay and the definition of the essay? Do you know Dr. Johnson's definition of an essay? Have you heard of that? A loose sally of the mind. Have you heard that definition? No? Dr. Johnson, the great Dr. Johnson, he says that an essay is a loose sally of the mind. That is, you're not trying to exhaust a subject, but you touch the essentials of the subject. And Narayan is able to do that. Simple things which you and I value. That is why he is so popular, because he speaks about you, about what you want, and about things to you in a language which is very accessible. So essay writing, a great essay writer, and his collection of essays have been put together also. There was a good scholar called Krishnan in Madras or Chennai. He put together all the works of Narayan in different volumes for the Viking Penguin. Penguin is the larger body, Viking is a part of Penguin, the publishers, and he's brought out what we might call the Viking editions of R.K. Narayan's works, novels, essays, travelogues, etc. So the essays. Then he was a short story writer, and for him the short story was usually a kind of a relaxation after writing a big novel. So when he wrote a novel, he gets exhausted. Of course, not that his novels were very long. I would call them long short stories, okay, or novelettes if you like, short novels. But even writing a novel, 80,000 words or 70,000 words is quite an effort. And once he had finished writing a novel, he couldn't write another novel for some time, but he had to write, because the writer's compulsion to write is something which we have to respect. We have to understand that. It's something like a habit. I must have my cup of coffee in the morning. If I can't have that cup of coffee, the whole day is hopeless. I must write 200 words at least in the morning. That is how R.K. Narayan wrote. Every day, a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. That's how he composed Swami and Friends also. Okay, but there is a book called R.K. Narayan, The Early Years. It's only about the years leading to the writing of that famous novel called The English Teacher in 1945. First novel, 1935, Swami and Friends. 1945, The English Teacher. And it's a terribly sad novel. I'll talk about it in a minute. And those years, of the early years of Narayan, beautifully described in all the details, etc., in this book. So try and read this biography if you can. Short stories, essays and short stories. Then he was also very interested in travel. Narayan was a great traveler. In fact, one of the things which he did when he failed his intermediate exam, so he had one whole year to write the exam again. In that 1 year, he simply walked around Mysore, around the Kukkanahalli tank, which is in the center of Mysore city. Walked around and met people and saw people, observed, and much of that becomes the subject matter of many of his novels. There's a chap called Chelluvayangar, who was actually a printer and a publisher, but he didn't spend much time in his printing house. He was very interested in the theatre. He was an amateur actor, and he had some ambitions of becoming a film actor. And Narayan knew this man, and he becomes the character called Sampath in the great novel called Sampath, Mr. Sampath. See, so from life, Narayan takes things and puts it into the novels. So when he walked all over Mysore, he observed many things, and he also wrote about his travels. The government of Mysore in those days even commissioned him to write a little travelogue, kind of a travel brochure about Mysore, which he published. Then he wrote a book called The Emerald Route. Okay? The Emerald Route is a travel account of Mysore, of the whole state of Karnataka. And in this, he gives you a wonderful picture of the geography of Karnataka, the topography of the state, the history and the myths and the stories and folklore associated with the place, a whole range of information, very readable, very anecdotal, and you feel that he is not just a dreary travel account, but almost a novel being written. It's called The Emerald Route. Then he wrote, went to America, and he's in 1957, and that is called My Dateless Diary. He doesn't put dates in that diary. Most people, are very particular about keeping the date, but here is a dateless diary in which he gives you a lot of information about what he saw in America, landing as he did in one part of America and traveling up to California to the other end of the country. And it is in America that he wrote that famous novel, The Guide, which many people think is his greatest novel. Though I think that novels like The Financial Expert and a novel like Grandmother's Tale, which is his last novel, are probably even better in some very, very profound ways. Dateless diary. I remember the diary for one very, very wonderful passage where he describes coffee, how coffee is brewed, how coffee is plucked, then how it is roasted, and then how it is ground, and then the aroma of coffee, the various configurations and the various proportions of milk and water and coffee powder, and the kind of taste which you get, the way you drink it, all these things are beautifully described by R.K. Narayan. Because one of the things in Narayan's novels and his writings is his great appreciation of food and drink. In fact, a whole thesis can be written on food and drink in R.K. Narayan. So one of these days, if you do an MPhil thesis, maybe you can write a little dissertation on food and drink in R.K. Narayan, or a house for R.K. Narayan, because again, house hunting and how houses should be built, what kind of a house one should live in, all these things mattered to Narayan. Simple things, but everyday common requirements of all human beings. Lovely, So, dateless diary. So, travel accounts. So, he wrote essays, he wrote short stories, he wrote travel accounts. He wrote an autobiography, and it is called My Days. My Days. Simple. But he only covers naturally, he can't cover everything. He can't cover it up to 2000 when he died, but he covers up to 1973 or thereabouts when, I think that was the time when he wrote this, little autobiography. And it gives some information, particularly about his childhood, about his schooling, about his love affairs. He fell in love with every woman he saw. But then, none of the women, of course, returned his, love. And then finally he saw the woman whom he wanted to marry. I think her name was Hema, and he married her. There were astrological objections to the marriage. But Narayan was revolutionary enough to say, to hell with astrology and the stars, I'll marry her. Unfortunately, the marriage, which was 6 years long, ended with his wife dying. And that shook him up so much that he couldn't write at all. So for nearly 6 years, after writing what is called The Dark Room, he could not write. And that was in 1939. 6 years later, he wrote The English Teacher, which was, of course, a completely autobiographical account of his love affair with his wife, his wonderful life with her, and the way in which she died, how he looked after her and tried to save her, the funeral, all those details are given to us. And more important than that, how to raise a child from that marriage. Because Narayan had one daughter whom he loved very much and who unfortunately died before Narayan died. And I think that really cracked him up. And I think his death in 2000 was, to some extent, the result of his inability to come to terms with the death of his favorite daughter. And the raising of that child, that is what the novel is about. And it's all about education. Okay? So, I've talked about essays, short stories, travel accounts, and I have talked about, about the autobiography. Novels, of course, he's written many novels. First novel, Swami and Friends. It's about the young Swami who is mischievous and who gets into all kinds of adventures and so on. They learn that the examination papers are being printed in some place, that they go to the the guard and try to bribe him into giving them the question paper. All these little things which we as children might have tried to do, because we also were very worried about exams, because we are all the time exam oriented, isn't it? Now Swami and Friends captures that. But it's an innocent childhood. Compare that with Stocky and Friends by Kipling. Stocky and Friends are, bullies. They are in a public school, and they are in the public school only in order to come to India and rule us. The public school is a training ground for governing the country, the colonies. So it's not an innocent childhood, while the children of Swami and Friends are innocent. So this older Swami becomes Chandran in the next novel called The Bachelor of Arts. And in that, of course, Narayan gives vent to his own ideas of falling in love with every woman he sees. And finally, Chandran also does the same thing. And then he is rejected by the one woman whom he thinks is going to be his life partner. And he runs away from home. He becomes a sannyasi and things of that kind. Of course, Narayan didn't do any of that. Okay? And Chandran comes back and lives a good life afterwards. Then comes The Dark Room, which is a story of two people who are married, but whose marriage is fraught with tensions. So what happens when two people are almost incompatible? And what happens to family when this happens? That seems to be the burden of The Dark Room. It is considered to be one of the early examples of feminist fiction, written by a male writer. Strong feminist sensibility. And Narayan actually has said that he didn't like the way women were treated in our society, and he was rebellious, and he wanted to try and show his sympathy for the cause of women in that novel. Then comes the tragedy of his wife's death. 6 years he's unable to write. In 1945, he writes The English Teacher. And then after that, of course, he continues to write a number of novels. You have The Guide, you have The Financial Expert, you have the Vendor of Sweets, you have Tiger of Malgudi, you have The Man-Eater of Malgudi, you have The Talkative Man, you have Nagaraj's Tale, and you have Grandmother's Tale. A number of novels, about 14 novels altogether. And he's like Jane Austen. He seems to be dealing with the same region, which he calls Malgudi. Now Malgudi apparently is a combination of a place called Mangudi and a place called Lalgudi. Lalgudi Jayaraman, you must have heard of, that great violinist. Lalgudi is in Tanjavur district in Tamil Nadu. Of course, Narayan is a Tamilian, so he has all those strong feelings for his native culture. And he mixes these and makes it Malgudi. And he plows the same field, novel after novel after novel. But this plowing becomes deeper and deeper and deeper, profounder and profounder, and you begin to appreciate the world of Malgudi. It becomes your own world. The characters there become your own characters. Many of them become you, and you become them. That's the kind of intimacy with which we are able to relate to Narayan. In a shorter span of life, Jane Austen did the same thing. In about 6 novels, she cultivated the same kind of background, the same upper class English society, the same problems of marriage, the same problems of villainy. Practically all her novels have a similar kind of plot structure. And I think that happens in Narayan too. There are 2 or 3 common strands in Narayan's novels. So if you read one novel, you can apply this structure to the other novels also. And that is of a young man growing up. And as you know, there are Hindu values involved here. What is called the ashrama dharma. You've heard of ashrama, varnashrama. That is, you start as a brahmachari, right? Celibate. Then you become a grihastha. That is, you're a married person, raising a family, making enough money to fulfill your obligations in society. Then after you have done all that and your children have grown up, you leave them aside for a while and become a vanaprastha. That is, you go away. Technically, you're supposed to go into the forest, but mentally, you're supposed to withdraw from the family so that the children can do their own thing. Otherwise, you'll be interfering in their lives. and that's not a good idea. And then finally you prepare yourself for sannyasa. So this fourfold path, or this 4 levels of existence, is a basic structure in many of Narayan's novels. That is why a very important critic of R.K. Narayan called Rao has said that the novels are guna novels, okay, guna novels. That is, they are about gunas or values, okay? Guna, sat guna, tamo guna, okay, rajo guna. You heard of these Sanskrit terms. Rajas is, vigorous and angry. Tamo is, totally lacking in any kind of energy. Sattva is subtle and transcendental and spiritual. So to a large extent in Narayan's novels, you will find that the characters come to terms with their lives and they transcend and they touch the important transcendental principle, or they at least try to move in the direction for transcendental peace and equilibrium. It happens in practically all the novels. A novel like The Financial Expert, Margaya, who has a terribly horrible son called Balu, and the way in which he is brought up, that child is all wrong. He's given him too much freedom, and Balu turns against his father and completely destroys the father's financial empire, the business. And he comes to the house drunk on occasions. He brings a woman whom he's supposed to have married. All kinds of things happen, and Margaya is completely shattered. But finally, Margaya comes to terms with this life and realizes that the way in which you should move is to settle in the family, be rooted in one dear perpetual place, as W.B. Yeats would put it, and raise the family according to certain values. Connect with the son, even though the son is such a recalcitrant young man. So Narayan affirms family values in his novels. And in fact, he's gone on record as having said that religion and family are very important for a novelist. If a novelist doesn't have religion, a feeling for religion, for spiritual values, and if he doesn't have a commitment, or she doesn't have a commitment to families, can't write a novel. And that gives you a key into the structure of a Narayan novel. In the 1970s, he began translating from the Kamba Ramayanam. So he's got a lovely translation of Ramayanam by Kamban into English, in which there are 2 episodes which he is unable to come to terms with. One is the episode of Rama killing Vali by shooting an arrow from behind without fighting him face to face. He's unable to come to terms with this. He doesn't think it redounds to Rama's credit. The other, he's unable to even write about it, but he mentions it, is Rama banishing Sita all over again. After having acquired her, after so much struggle from Ravana, he rejects her again, and he's unable to excuse Rama for that. So you see, there is that strong feminist feeling in R.K. Narayan. That is why he makes a lot of sense to people in our times, because we also have these very strong opinions about man and woman relationships, about the equality of the sexes and so on. And we can't tolerate novelists or writers who don't seem to have a respect for women and what they stand for. Narayan has that respect. So Ramayana he translates. He also translates the Mahabharata. And what he did was to actually bring Sanskrit scholars home and then go over these texts day by day, day by day. He prepared himself, making notes. They gave him interpretations. And then the great novelist he was able to convert all this information which he got from various scholars into a beautiful telling of a story. So it's his own story. The Mahabharata is not Vyasa now, it is R.K. Narayan speaking. Right? So that way it becomes his version of a great epic. Then he also translated some of the folk stories and some of the myths which are important in our culture, and these have been put together in a book called Gods, Demons and Others. This is a very delightful book, and if some of us want to have a quick introduction to Indian culture, particularly our Hindu past. We have to make a distinction here. India is not just Hindu, but it's one aspect of India is Hindu, but it's the dominant part of our culture. Therefore, if you want to understand that past, then I think R.K. Narayan provides us a wonderful window through to things. Okay, so he's done translations, or what we might even call transcreations. It's not a translation of a text word to word or anything like that, or paragraph to paragraph, but the gist of it, and beautifully put together in his own storytelling capacity. And that's what makes Narayan such an interesting writer. Would you like to ask me a question or two at this point about anything which I have said so far? Or if there's something which I have not touched on, of course I have not touched on many things in Narayan, you might like to ask a question.
Can you repeat the name of his biography, autobiography?
Yeah, it is called My Days, okay?
And the biography?
The biography is simply called R.K. Narayan, The Early Years. Okay, let me ask a question then. Do you understand what a realistic novel is? Usually a realistic novel will be linear, isn't it? It starts at one point and then moves forward and comes to a certain other stage. It seems to be a straightforward, direct movement from one point to the other. But there are novels which are not linear and which are not necessarily realist. Now Narayan, by and large, uses the realist form, but within it he complicates things by fantasizing, by giving you grotesque scenes, by giving you all kinds of funny situations which don't seem to be realistic.
Book A Tiger for Malgudi, he presents a very, it's like a tiger talking.
Exactly.
But at the same time, he's quite, we can actually relate to the feeling. So would you call it a realistic novel?
It is not a realistic novel because it's a fable. And because fabulation automatically takes you away from human reality, okay? You have to see this as part of Narayan's capacity for writing non-realistic fiction. There may be a linear plot in the novel, which of course it does have, but the very idea of a tiger speaking, right? A tiger becoming un-tiger-like, it actually shares a saucer of milk with a goat, natural enemies, all right? Natural victim for a tiger, and yet it happens because of the influence of the guru, because the tiger slowly begins to become subtler and subtler and purer until it loses its tigerishness and becomes a sattvic individual. So Narayan is giving you a kind of a fable and telling us human beings, well, the tiger is able to do things which you should be doing. The tiger is capable of sattvic living, while you and I, human beings, are becoming more and more like tigers, right? So there is some kind of a moral message there, a didactic message there, but he is never overtly didactic. He writes a novel and subtly suggests meanings, but never preaches, never teaches openly. That's how I think a great teacher is like that. A great teacher is one who doesn't seem to be teaching, but who is all the time teaching, right? And that's what happens in R.K. Narayan. Okay? I think I have said quite a bit about R.K. Narayan, and I hope this has been a good introduction to him, and that you'll go and read all the novels of R.K. Narayan, each one of you. Thank you for being such a good audience.